The Council of Nicaea is often presented as a purely theological event, a gathering where early Christian leaders clarified doctrine and settled disputes about Jesus' nature. But when we look closer, the story is as much about politics as it is about theology. Power, influence, and control were at the heart of this council. And understanding that makes the traditional narrative far less sacred than many would like to believe. At the beginning of the 4th century, Christianity was far from unified. There were dozens of interpretations of Jesus' life and teachings, each competing for followers and influence. Some viewed him as fully divine, others as fully human, and others as somewhere in between. These debates were not abstract. They were tied to communities, bishops, and the resources they controlled. If you controlled belief, you controlled loyalty, donations, and social cohesion. Emperor Constantine saw an opportunity in this chaos. He had recently consolidated power across the Roman Empire and was searching for ways to stabilize it. Religion, and Christianity in particular, offered a unifying force, but only if it could be streamlined and controlled. Constantine's goal was not purely spiritual, it was political. He needed a religion that could support a cohesive empire, reduce factional violence, and consolidate his authority. That's where Nicaea comes in. In 325 CE, Constantine convened bishops from across the empire to settle the question of Christ's nature. The theological debate centered on the controversy between Arius, a priest from Alexandria, and his opponents, who insisted Jesus was co-eternal with God the Father. On the surface, it appears to be a simple doctrinal clarification, but beneath that surface lay questions of power, hierarchy, and imperial strategy. Arius's view threatened the established order in several ways. By emphasizing Jesus as subordinate to God, it disrupted the emerging orthodoxy that could be used to unify the empire under one authoritative church. Bishops who opposed him were not just defending theology, they were defending the institutional power of the church and its alignment with the emperor. Votes at Nicaea were as much about political alliances as they were about scripture. Constantine's presence at Nicaea was pivotal. He didn't claim divine authority in the theological sense, but his hand guided the proceedings. Records suggest he exerted pressure on bishops, influencing the outcome in favor of unity rather than allowing continued division. The creed that emerged, the Nicene Creed, wasn't simply a statement of faith. It was a tool of governance. It codified a version of Christianity that aligned with imperial interests and centralized authority. The aftermath of the council reveals just how political it truly was. Arius's teachings were condemned, and he was exiled, but his ideas did not vanish overnight. They persisted for decades, supported by different factions within the empire. Bishops and regional leaders continued to leverage theological disputes as political weapons, shaping alliances and rivalries that had little to do with personal belief and everything to do with power. Nicaea also illustrates the early church's relationship with state authority. By seeking the emperor's involvement, the church set a precedent for the fusion of religious and political power. From that moment forward, orthodoxy was enforced not only through persuasion or debate, but through imperial support, coercion, and sometimes violence. The theological questions were inseparable from the structures of control and governance. It's worth noting how different the council might have appeared to ordinary people at the time. For many believers, the debates were abstract and distant, conducted in formal language and intricate theological terms. But the decisions reached had real consequences, which bishops retained influence, which regions had official doctrine, and which interpretations were marginalized or suppressed. The council was less about spiritual guidance and more about shaping social order. There are also economic dimensions to consider. Control over doctrine meant control over resources, land, donations, and the distribution of charity. Bishops who aligned with the imperial position often found themselves with greater access to wealth and influence. Arius's exile wasn't just a spiritual judgment, it was also a removal of a competitor in the political economy of the early church. The Council of Nicaea also reveals how history itself can be shaped by those in power. The versions of events we often hear come from victors. Bishops aligned with Constantine, official records preserved by dominant factions, and later historians who favored the orthodox narrative. Alternative perspectives, dissenting voices, and minority theological positions were minimized, silenced, or erased. What we now call the Nicene tradition was crafted as much by political necessity as by genuine theological consensus. Even the Nicene Creed itself demonstrates compromise and calculation. Some language was deliberately chosen to be ambiguous enough to gain broad acceptance while still favoring the emerging orthodoxy. Words like consubstantial and phrasing about Jesus' divinity weren't purely spiritual decisions. They were political tools designed to consolidate a fragile coalition of bishops under a common banner. The council also had long-term implications for Christianity's evolution. By centralizing doctrine and tying it to imperial power, it created a model for how religion could be used as a tool of the state. Future councils, edicts, and doctrinal disputes would follow the template established at Nicaea. Debates conducted under the watchful eye of political authority, outcomes determined by alliances, and dissent punished or marginalized. Looking back, the Council of Nicaea challenges the idea that Christianity's early development was purely spiritual or divinely guided. It shows that what many take for granted as theological truth was in large part the outcome of negotiation, persuasion, and political maneuvering. Religion, in its formative centuries, was inseparable from the quest for influence, stability, and control. It's also important to consider the human element. Bishops were not neutral arbiters of divine truth. They were individuals with ambition, loyalty, and vested interests. Decisions were influenced by relationships, regional rivalries, and personal survival. The ecumenical nature of Nicaea masks the intense politics, maneuvering, and compromise behind the scenes. This perspective reshapes how we understand the origins of orthodoxy. What later generations revered as the correct faith was not simply divinely revealed. It was the version that won the backing of the most powerful man in the empire. The emperor's preference, combined with the bishop's desire for influence, ensured a certain outcome. And that outcome shaped Christianity for centuries to come. We can also see the ripple effects in how dissent was treated after the council. Those who disagreed with the Nicene position were marginalized, exiled, or even executed in extreme cases. The council set the precedent that theological disagreement was not only a spiritual concern, but a political liability. Orthodoxy became a mechanism of power, and heresy a threat to order. Even today, the Council of Nicaea is often framed as a triumph of reasoned debate and theological clarity. But when we examine it through the lens of power dynamics, it reads more like a complex negotiation of authority. A meeting where words were carefully chosen, alliances were forged, and the future of a billion believers was shaped as much by politics as by theology. In that sense, Nicaea is less about faith and more about human nature. The drive to consolidate influence, to unify under a single banner, to manage conflict and control resources. All of these forces shape decisions that centuries later are still treated as divine mandates. Understanding this history gives a more nuanced view of early Christianity, one where politics, power, and pragmatism were inseparable from theology. The lessons of Nicaea extend beyond religion. They show how human institutions, even those claiming divine guidance, are shaped by worldly concerns. Belief systems are rarely just about truth claims. They are intertwined with power, hierarchy, and governance. And recognizing that allows us to see religious history not as a linear path of revelation, but as a complex web of influence, negotiation, and strategic calculation. The Council of Nicaea was, in many ways, the first major demonstration of organized religious politics in Christianity. It set a precedent for centuries of councils, debates, and doctrinal enforcement. It reminds us that what appears sacred is often deeply human, and that much of what we call history is really the story of power, carefully preserved and transmitted through the lens of the victors. Understanding the Council of Nicaea in this light changes how we view the origins of religious authority. It reframes doctrinal debates not as purely spiritual journeys, but as struggles over influence, control, and survival. The Nicene Creed, for all its theological weight, was also a political instrument, and the events surrounding it reveal a truth often hidden behind sacred texts. The intersection of belief and power is inseparable. While Constantine's involvement is often highlighted, it's important to understand how local power struggles influence the council. Bishops weren't just debating abstract theology, they were jockeying for influence within the empire's rapidly evolving church structure. Cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome were not equal in wealth, prestige, or political leverage. The outcomes at Nicaea reflected these imbalances as much as they did doctrinal correctness. Alexandria, for instance, was a powerhouse of theological scholarship and political influence. Arius, its local priest, had gained a following precisely because he challenged established hierarchies. His argument that Jesus was subordinate to God threatened the dominance of senior bishops who saw orthodoxy as a way to maintain their authority. By framing the debate in theological terms, these bishops were also defending their institutional control. Antioch presented a different challenge. Its bishops had their own interpretations and rivalries with Alexandria. When representatives from these regions met at Nicaea, the debates were not just about divinity, they were about whose interpretation would be enforced empire-wide. Every vote carried consequences for local power structures, donations, and influence over congregations. Constantine, aware of these dynamics, approached the council with a pragmatic mindset. He understood that religious unity was a tool of governance. A fractured church risked civil unrest, competing loyalties, and weakened imperial authority. By pushing for consensus on the nature of Christ, Constantine was effectively centralizing ideological control to stabilize the empire. The council also reflected social hierarchies within Christianity itself. Senior bishops wielded authority not only over doctrine, but over vast networks of local priests and laypeople. For them, defining orthodoxy was a way to legitimize their own positions. Doctrinal decisions were inseparable from questions of who would be obeyed, who would control church property, and whose influence would extend across regions. Interestingly, attendance at Nicaea was itself political. Bishops were invited by imperial decree, which meant Constantine could ensure the presence of allies and the absence of strong opponents. This was not a neutral gathering of equals. Power dynamics shaped who could speak, who could vote, and whose opinions carried weight. The council's decisions were guided as much by political calculus as by theological argument. Even the phrasing of the Nicene Creed was politically strategic. Terms like homoousios, meaning of the same substance, were chosen not only to clarify doctrine but to forge unity among divergent factions. It was a compromise designed to minimize dissent while elevating certain bishops' authority. Language itself became a tool of control. Exiling Arius was another demonstration of how politics shaped outcomes. His removal was not only a theological statement, it was a clear signal that dissent would not be tolerated when it threatened unity and imperial objectives. The exile served as both punishment and deterrent, reinforcing the intertwined nature of religion and political power. The council also had implications for ordinary believers. While they did not attend the debates, they were directly affected by the decisions made in Nicaea. Which bishops were recognized, which teachings were sanctioned, and which interpretations were labeled heretical all shaped daily religious practice. In effect, theology became legislation enforced from the top down. This pattern of top-down enforcement continued for centuries. Nicaea set the template for how councils, synods, and creeds would be used to manage belief, consolidate authority, and suppress opposition. The theological debates were inseparable from empire-wide social, political, and economic considerations. We can also see how historical narratives were shaped after the council. Later church historians framed Nicaea as a triumph of reasoned debate and divine guidance. They downplayed the political maneuvering, imperial pressure, and local rivalries that dominated the actual events. The story that reaches us today often masks the human power struggles at the heart of the council. The council's political dimensions also affected the development of Christian orthodoxy across the empire. Bishops aligned with imperial authority gained precedence in ecclesiastical appointments, regional influence, and doctrinal enforcement. Those who resisted faced marginalization, exile, or worse. The establishment of a dominant orthodoxy was as much a consolidation of power as a clarification of belief. Even the treatment of heresy can be traced back to Nicaea's political logic. By labeling Arius's views as heretical and exiling him, the council established a precedent for using doctrinal enforcement to maintain institutional control. Future councils would follow this pattern, demonstrating that theological disputes were inseparable from political stakes. By examining Nicaea through this lens, we can see how early Christianity was shaped by strategy and negotiation rather than pure revelation. Religious texts, creeds, and councils were instruments for structuring power, managing conflict, and consolidating influence across a sprawling empire. Belief was intertwined with authority from the very beginning. Even today, the Council of Nicaea is cited as evidence of divine guidance in establishing orthodoxy. But understanding its political context allows a more nuanced perspective. The council was not only about clarifying doctrine, it was about controlling a religious movement that had grown too influential to remain decentralized. The empire, the bishops, and the debates all interacted in ways that were profoundly human and pragmatic. The consequences of Nicaea extended far beyond theology. By linking religious authority with imperial power, the council established a model for centuries of church-state interaction. Orthodoxy became a tool for governance, dissent a threat to social order, and doctrine a means to consolidate influence. Every subsequent council, heresy trial, and doctrinal enforcement echoes the political logic first demonstrated at Nicaea. In short, understanding the Council of Nicaea requires looking beyond theology. It reveals the human desire for power, stability, and control. The bishops, the emperor, and the debates were all operating within a framework where ideas and authority were inseparable. What we often see as purely spiritual history is, at its core, deeply political. The Council of Nicaea didn't just settle one theological dispute. It set the stage for centuries of political maneuvering within Christianity. Once the Nicene Creed was established, the alliance between church and state became a defining feature of Western history. Bishops who aligned with imperial authority gained power not only over spiritual matters, but over social, legal, and even economic affairs in their regions. This early fusion of politics and religion created a model where theological debates were inseparable from questions of governance. Disagreements about doctrine became disagreements about loyalty, influence, and legitimacy. A bishop's theological stance could determine whether their city retained imperial favor or faced marginalization. The stakes were high, and the outcomes had real-world consequences far beyond abstract belief. The Nicene model also influenced the way dissent was treated. Arius's exile was more than punishment. It was a warning to other potential challengers. By labeling certain interpretations as heretical, the council established a system where deviation from orthodoxy could be used to justify political or social sanctions. This precedent would echo through centuries, from the medieval enforcement of church law to inquisitions and doctrinal trials. Even the concept of orthodoxy itself became a tool of control. By defining a correct belief, church leaders could consolidate influence and marginalize competitors. The Nicene Creed was not just a theological statement. It was a political instrument designed to unify factions under a single authoritative framework. And in doing so, it demonstrated how religious language could serve as a mechanism of governance. The empire-wide impact of Nicaea also highlights the role of communication and propaganda in shaping belief. Messages about the council's decisions were disseminated through churches, sermons, and letters from bishops. Ordinary believers learned which teachings were approved and which were condemned. This top-down communication reinforced imperial authority while also embedding the council's decisions into everyday religious practice. In many ways, Nicaea can be seen as the birth of centralized religious authority in Christianity. Before the council, beliefs were diverse, local, and often fluid. After the council, a single, politically endorsed orthodoxy began to dominate. The combination of imperial support and doctrinal standardization ensured that certain ideas would survive and flourish, while others would fade into obscurity. It's also worth considering the economic dimension. Bishops who aligned with the Nicene consensus often gained access to more resources, influence over charitable distribution, and prestige within both church and society. Control over orthodoxy became intertwined with control over wealth and social capital. The political and economic incentives were as significant as the theological ones. The council's long-term influence extends beyond the Roman Empire. As Christianity spread, the model established at Nicaea influenced how new regions organized their churches, resolved disputes, and enforced orthodoxy. The combination of centralized authority and doctrinal enforcement became a template for managing large, diverse populations under a single religious framework. Even centuries later, the echoes of Nicaea's political logic can be seen in the way church hierarchies operate, how religious debates are framed, and how dissent is handled. Councils, synods, and theological debates remain tied to questions of authority, legitimacy, and influence. The patterns established in 325 CE set enduring precedents that shaped the trajectory of Christianity and its relationship with secular power. The Council also shows how religious history can be selective and constructed. The narrative presented in later texts emphasizes divine guidance, moral clarity, and the triumph of orthodoxy. What is often omitted are the human elements: ambition, negotiation, coercion, and compromise. Understanding these dynamics provides a more complete and realistic view of how religious institutions develop and maintain power. In examining Nicaea, we also see how belief and social cohesion are intertwined. For Constantine, doctrinal unity was less about personal faith and more about social stability. A unified church meant a unified empire. Divergent theological interpretations were not tolerated because they threatened political order, not simply because they were wrong in a spiritual sense. This perspective reframes our understanding of early Christianity. The Council of Nicaea was not simply a meeting of pious leaders seeking divine truth. It was a political instrument, a strategic gathering, and a blueprint for consolidating power through doctrine. The outcomes were shaped as much by human interests, negotiation, and authority as they were by theological insight. Even the language of the Nicene Creed reflects this dual purpose. Terms were carefully chosen to bridge competing factions, minimize rebellion, and create an appearance of unity. Theology and politics were inseparable, and the language itself became a tool of both persuasion and control. The Council also highlights the broader interplay between religion and empire. Constantine's intervention demonstrates that spiritual decisions were often subordinate to political necessity. Religious leaders gained influence by aligning with imperial priorities, while the empire leveraged belief as a stabilizing force. This symbiotic relationship would shape the trajectory of European history for centuries. Ultimately, Nicaea illustrates a timeless principle. Religious institutions are human creations, shaped by social, political, and economic pressures. Belief systems may claim divine authority, but their structures, rules, and enforcement mechanisms are deeply rooted in human concerns. The Nicene Council offers a vivid example of how ideas, power, and authority intersect to shape both history and belief. By studying the Council this way, we gain insight into how orthodoxy, authority, and influence functioned in the earliest centuries of Christianity. The decisions made at Nicaea were not simply theological, they were strategic, political, and profoundly human. And the consequences of those decisions have resonated across centuries, influencing not only religious practice, but social and political organization as well. The cultural impact of the Council of Nicaea was profound. By enforcing a single interpretation of Jesus' nature, it began the process of shaping a shared religious identity across the empire. This identity was less about individual spiritual insight and more about conformity, social cohesion, and alignment with centralized authority. Belief became a marker of loyalty, not just faith. Psychologically, the Council set a precedent for how people internalize authority. When a bishop or emperor declares an interpretation correct, communities often accept it with little question. The combination of spiritual language and political power creates a form of social conditioning. People learn that compliance with orthodoxy is expected, dissent is dangerous, and deviation carries consequences. This influence extends beyond theology, shaping social behavior, morality, and even local governance. The labeling of heresy is one of the most significant legacies of Nicaea. By condemning Arius and his followers, the Council established the notion that disagreement could be treated as a threat to unity and order. Heresy was not just a spiritual error, it was a political liability. Over time, the enforcement of orthodoxy became a mechanism to maintain social cohesion, prevent rebellion, and centralize control. These mechanisms also affected cultural production. art, literature, and liturgy began to reflect the dominant theological interpretations established at Nicaea. Stories that contradicted the Nicene Creed were suppressed or altered. Rituals were standardized to reinforce the sanctioned version of belief. The Council's political decisions shaped not only doctrine but also the cultural expression of Christianity. One fascinating aspect is how Nicaea influenced later church councils. The council established a model: convene religious leaders, enforce a politically useful orthodoxy, and marginalize dissent. Councils such as Constantinople, Chalcedon, and later ecumenical meetings followed the same pattern. Theology was inseparable from hierarchy and governance. Disagreement became a matter of political concern as much as a matter of belief. The empire's involvement in these councils also reinforced the perception that religious authority could not be separated from political authority. The Nicene Council demonstrated that rulers could guide, influence, or even dictate religious outcomes. This blurred line between spiritual and temporal power would shape not only Christianity but the wider structure of European governance for centuries. At the same time, Nicaea's decisions reveal the fragility of consensus. Even after the council, disputes persisted, and factions continued to fight for influence. This shows that political power alone does not create belief. It enforces compliance, but hearts and minds remain complex. The council's decisions were the starting point, not the end point, of orthodoxy. The long-term psychological effect on believers is also striking. By defining a single acceptable interpretation, the council created a framework where questioning or doubt was socially risky. People learned that religious belief was tied to identity, community, and even survival. The alignment of faith with social and political conformity became embedded in the culture of Christianity. Even today, echoes of Nicaea's political strategies can be seen in the enforcement of orthodoxy, the treatment of dissent, and the structure of religious hierarchies. The Council demonstrates that the appearance of divine guidance often masks strategic human decision-making. Authority, persuasion, and politics are inseparable from the formation of what we now call tradition. The Council's influence also extended to education and intellectual life. Bishops who conformed to the Nicene line controlled teaching, scriptural interpretation, and clerical appointments. Alternative interpretations were sidelined, and the intellectual development of Christianity was channeled through a politically sanctioned lens. Knowledge itself became a tool of orthodoxy and power. This political foundation also shaped the moral and social rules imposed on believers. Orthodoxy became a benchmark for correct behavior, social interaction, and loyalty to both church and empire. The theological decisions made at Nicaea were amplified through legal and cultural mechanisms, creating a society in which deviation was not only heretical but socially risky. By understanding Nicaea in this context, we see that religious history is often inseparable from political strategy. The council was not merely a theological exercise. It was a masterclass in shaping belief, controlling dissent, and consolidating authority. The so-called truths that emerged were inseparable from the context of human ambition, negotiation, and power. The Council of Nicaea also reminds us that ideas, even when presented as absolute or divinely inspired, are shaped by circumstance. Bishops, emperors, and local factions influenced which teachings survived and which were discarded. Orthodoxy was constructed, negotiated, and enforced to serve both spiritual and worldly objectives. Even the Nicene Creed itself, often revered as a theological cornerstone, was as much a political tool as a statement of faith. The careful language, compromise, and inclusivity reflected strategic calculations about unity, authority, and control. The Creed's enduring influence is a testament to how political savvy can outlast theological debate. Finally, the Council's legacy teaches a broader lesson about religion and power. It shows that human institutions, even those claiming divine authority, are influenced by social, political, and economic pressures. Belief may guide behavior, but structure, enforcement, and hierarchy are shaped by human priorities. And in the case of Nicaea, politics, strategy, and authority were inseparable from the formation of orthodoxy. The long-term consequences of the Council of Nicaea are staggering. By uniting theology with imperial authority, the council ensured that Christianity would evolve not only as a spiritual system, but as a tool of governance. Bishops gained political power, emperors gained ideological control, and ordinary believers became participants in a carefully managed social order. This fusion of religion and politics created a template for centuries to come. Church councils, doctrinal enforcement, and the treatment of dissent all followed the model first demonstrated at Nicaea. Orthodoxy became a measure of loyalty, heresy a threat to stability, and theological debate a form of political negotiation. The stakes were rarely purely spiritual. The council also reshaped the way power is exercised within religious institutions. Authority became centralized, with bishops and clergy aligned to imperial objectives receiving precedence. Control over doctrine meant control over education, resources, and influence across communities. The human element, ambition, alliances, and negotiation, was central to the outcomes, yet it is often obscured in traditional accounts. Nicaea's decisions also had psychological effects on believers that endure even today. By defining a single acceptable interpretation, the council created a culture where conformity is expected, questioning is risky, and belief is intertwined with identity. Orthodoxy became both a personal and a social obligation, reinforced by hierarchy and authority. The council's political nature also influenced the way heresy is perceived. By framing dissent as dangerous to unity and stability, Nicaea set a precedent for centuries of doctrinal policing. Religious disagreement became not only a spiritual issue, but a matter of social and political consequence. This principle persisted through medieval Europe, shaping inquisitions, trials, and church governance. Culturally, the council influenced the arts, literature, and ritual practices of Christianity. Stories, symbols, and liturgies were aligned with the Nicene interpretation, while alternative perspectives were suppressed or forgotten. In shaping orthodoxy, Nicaea shaped culture itself, demonstrating that the council's impact extended far beyond abstract theology. The council also serves as a reminder that history is written by those in power. The narrative we inherit emphasizes divine guidance and theological clarity, often ignoring the negotiation, coercion, and political maneuvering behind the scenes. Understanding Nicaea's context allows us to see the human agency at play, the strategic decision-making, and the interplay of authority and ambition. Even modern perceptions of religious authority are influenced by Nicaea's legacy. Centralized hierarchies, the enforcement of orthodoxy, and the alignment of belief with social conformity all trace back to the political logic demonstrated at the council. The relationship between religion and power is not a modern invention. It was evident from the very first ecumenical gatherings. The council also highlights the fragility of consensus. Despite the official outcomes, disputes and factions persisted. Arius's teachings continued to circulate for decades, supported by different regional powers. This demonstrates that political and theological decisions can enforce compliance but cannot instantly control thought or belief. Orthodoxy was constructed, yes, but it remained contested, shaped by ongoing negotiation and enforcement. Looking back, the Council of Nicaea illustrates the inseparable relationship between human ambition, politics, and religion. What is often presented as divine revelation or spiritual truth was also the product of negotiation, compromise, and authority. Bishops, emperors, and communities all played a role in creating what would become the foundation of mainstream Christianity. It also teaches a broader lesson about institutional power. Religious institutions, no matter how sacred they claim to be, operate within human social, political, and economic frameworks. Belief may inspire, but authority, enforcement, and cohesion are driven by pragmatic concerns. Nicaea is a prime example of how ideas, influence, and governance are intertwined. In conclusion, the Council of Nicaea was not merely a theological milestone. It was a political turning point, a masterclass in shaping belief, consolidating power, and managing dissent. Its legacy persists in the structure of religious authority, the enforcement of orthodoxy, and the way belief and power remain intertwined to this day. By understanding the Council in this light, we gain a more nuanced view of early Christianity. We see it not as a purely divine project, but as a deeply human enterprise. one where politics, ambition, and strategy were inseparable from theology, and where the echoes of these decisions continue to shape religion, culture, and society centuries later. The Council of Nicaea reminds us that history is rarely simple, and that the stories we inherit are often shaped by power, strategy, and human interests. Faith, authority, and politics have always been intertwined, and recognizing that allows us to better understand not only the past, but the enduring structures that influence belief and society today.